We continue now at the top of Daf Vavam and Aleph and Meseches Zevachim. This is Zevachim Daf 6a. On the previous summit, the Gemara was discussing the conversation between Reish Lakish and Rebbe Elazar. Reish Lakish had said, why does it make sense to say that in the cases of the Mishnah where a person brings a carbon shelo lishma, that the carbon is brought, but it's not miratza, meaning to say it is brought, but it does not fulfill the obligations of the owner. If you're already bringing the carbon, it should in fact fulfill the obligations of the owner. And Rebbe Elazar had responded to Reish Lakish that we do find such a situation where a carbon is brought, but it doesn't fulfill the obligations of the owner, because that can happen in a situation where a carbon is brought after the owner has died. So in that situation, the Yarshim, they bring the carbon, but of course it does not fulfill the any atonement for the owner or any obligations for the owner, because the owner has already died. And so the Gemara in the previous Amud asked, why didn't Reish Lakish respond that maybe in a situation where Yarshim bring a carbon, in fact it is an atonement, it is a kapara for the Yarshim themselves? Who says that it's not a kapara for the Yarshim, and therefore you have no proof from a situation where the owner died? And the Gemara continued on the previous summit and brought a proof to the idea that in fact the Yarshim might get a kapara because they are considered to be the owners of the carbon. The Gemara on the previous summit related those two ideas to one another. If the Yarshim inherit the carbon, then it's possible to understand that they're getting a kapara from that carbon. And the way we know that the Yarshim inherit the carbon is from a statement of Rabbi Yochanan, because Rabbi Yochanan said if a person leaves over an animal to his two sons so they can bring that carbon, the animal that's being left over is a carbon, they can bring that animal as a carbon, and ein memirin ba, there is no tmura. The idea of tmura is that a person is not supposed to take an animal that's a carbon and make an exchange for that animal. The halach is if the person does make an exchange, then it becomes what's called a tmura, meaning the original animal is kodesh and the tmura is kodesh. But in this situation where the two sons inherit the animal that's a carbon, there is no tmura, meaning to say the animal, that second animal, does not become a carbon. And so the Gemara had said, now if you're going to say that the Yarshim inherit the carbon, that makes perfect sense, because they inherit the animal, the carbon, together, and they are partners. And there's a general rule, the Gemara now continues, v'shutvin lo matzu memirin. There's a general rule that partners, there's no tmura when it comes to partners. Rashi explains, v'shutvin lo matzu memirin, detanya, because we learned in a braysa, kol memirin chutz min hashutvim. Everyone can make tmura except for partners, l'fisha kol haparsha kula nemra b'lashon yachid, because the entire parsha said in singular, kimo lo yachlifenu v'lo yamiro so v'im hamer yamer echad meimer v'lo shnayim memir. And so we learn out from there that an individual, one person can be meimer, but not two people. And so that statement of Rabbi Yochanan would make sense if there is a kinyan when it comes to the carbon. Elo yamrit lo kanya lahu, but if you're going to say that there's no kinyan, so amure nami limro, so then there should be tmura, and so therefore that is a proof that there is a kinyan. And the Gemara continues and answers, Shani Hasam, no, it's different over there. Diyomar Kra, because the Pasuk says, Im Hamer Yomir, L'Rabos Es HaYoresh. It actually is a specific inclusion that a Yoresh is able to make Tmura, and we learn out, Echad Meimir Vein Shnayim Mimir, and that one is able to, and two are not. And Rashi explains, Shani Hasam is different over there, meaning, Afagav Delo Kanyalahu, even though there's no Kinyan, Gzeras HaKosavu, it just is a Gzeras HaKosav. Teshnei Yorshin Ein Memirin Zevach, that two Yorshim are not able to make Tmura by a carbon, Shefer Shavian, by a carbon that was separated by their father. Echad Meimir, again, one is able to make Tmura, Dahad Yorish Meimir B'Carbon Aviv, the idea that a Yorish makes Tmura by the carbon of his father, Mehachan Afgalan is learned out from this Pasuk, Im Hamir, L'Rabo says Yorish. It says Im Hamir, that includes the Yorish, that includes the heir, the Havimotzi L'Michtav Im Yomir, it could have just said Im Yomir, V'Hachanami B'Lashon Yachid Kasve, and again over here it says it in singular, and so therefore it's an independent source, it has nothing to do with any kinds of kinyanim. And the Gemara continues, Maskif Lo Rav Yaakov Minahar Pekod. Rav Yaakov from Nahar Pekod, he asked the following question. Elamayata, but according to that, if you're going to make this drush of Hamir Yomir, so Gabi Meister, when it comes to Meister Sheni, Techsiv that it's written a very similar Lashon of him, Gol Yigal, it says that if he's going to redeem the Meister Sheni, L'Rabos Asa Yorish, and there we say that includes an heir. Yorish is also able to redeem the Meister Sheni. So Hachanami, are you going to make the same thing? Are you also going to say over here, Echad Goel Ve'en Shnayim Goelin, that one Yoresh is able to redeem and two are not able to redeem? If you're going to make the drasha when it comes to Tmura, you should make it by Meiser Sheni as well. And the Gemara says not necessarily. Shani Meiser, it's different by Meiser Sheni. Degabe avuhon nami isei b'shutfis, because there it's possible that even the father was a partner and there would still be redemption of Meiser Sheni by the father. So therefore you're going to say the same thing by the heirs. That is not true when it comes to Tmura. As we said that Shutvin, there is no Tmura. Rashi explains him Yugal Ishmi Masro L'Rabos Yoresh Shemosif Chomesh. What we're talking about over here is that a Yoresh, when he redeems the Meiser Sheni, he has to add on a fifth Upoda as Meiser Aviv. and then he redeems the meiser of his father. And Isay v'shutfis, there's a concept of partnership by meiser sheni. The lo eshkechon demimit shutfin mipidyon meiser sheni. We don't find that partners are excluded from redemption of meiser sheni. It's mura hainu taima mishum dechol parsha nemra b'loshen yachid. And again, when it comes to Tumura, the reason is because the entire parsha is said b'loshen yachid, is said in the singular. And the Gemara continues, Amar le Ravasi le Ravashi. Ravasi said to Ravashi, Umina, but from the halach itself that a Yorish is Meimer and Shnayim, 2 Yorshim are not Memirin, from that halach itself we can still prove that the Yorish is Kona. Because the Amr Bishlam Akanyalhu, because if you're going to say correctly that there's a Kinyan, Hainu Dechan Mia Meimer, then it would make sense to say that that one Yorish is able to make Tmura. Elu Yamr Lo Kanyalhu, but if you're going to say there is no Kinyan, Heichi Meimer, how is it that he can make Tmura? V'ho Amar Rabbi Avo, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, but Rabbi Avo said that Rabbi Yochanan said, Hamakdish Mosef Chomesh, Umischaper Osa Tmura. Let's say you have a situation where one person consecrates an animal, but really that animal is going to be brought as a korban for a kapara for somebody else. So you have a makdish and you have a mischaper. So Rabbi Yochanan said that the makdish, the person who consecrated, if he wants to redeem that animal, let's say develops a blemish, he's the one that is mosef chomesh. He's considered to be the owner of that animal in that regard, in terms of the redemption and adding a fifth. But mischaper, it's the one who is getting the atonement, the one who's getting the kapara, he's the one that makes tamura. And so then going back to exactly what we were discussing, again on the previous Amud, the discussion was that why don't we say that when you have a situation of a Yorish, why don't we say that when you have a situation of an heir by a korban, let's say the person who is the owner of the korban dies and now the Yorish is the one that offers the korban, we should say that he gets a kapara, and that's exactly what we're saying over here, that the mischaper is osa tmura, so that also implies that in this situation where we have the Yorish is the mischaper, he's the one getting the atonement, and that's why the Yorish is able to make tmura. So from this halach itself, we should be able to resolve everything we've been discussing, that number one, there is a kinyan, and that number two, in fact, the Yorish does get a kapara in this situation. And the Gemara continues, V'hatore mishalo al shal chaveru, this is just a continuation of the statement of Rabbi Yochanan, if someone takes off truma from his own property for his friends, so in that situation, tovas hana shalo, the tovas hana is his. The tovas hana refers to the fact that a person who takes off truma, he gets a slight benefit that he gets to choose which kohen he gives the truma to. There's even a slight possible monetary benefit for that. And so over here, when somebody's taking truma off of his own property, off his own produce for his friend's produce, so he's the one that gets the tovas hana. But in any case, again, it would seem to be that if the Yorish is meimer, if the Yorish makes tmura, the Yorish is also getting the kapara. There really is a kinyan over here. And the Gemara continues and answers, Mikiva lo mechapra mikufya mechapra. It does not atone by its essence, it just atones incidentally, meaning there is a kapara, but it's not really a full kapara for the Yorish. There's not really a kinyan for the Yorish and not a full kapara, but it is enough of a kapara to make tmura. And Rashi explains, Umashani, the Gemara answers, Mikivalo mechapra, it is not essentially a kapara, but mikufya mechapra, but it is a kapara incidentally. Kapara kavua, meaning to say, a fixed kapara. Sheyehe yorish bail of mamish, that we mamish consider the yorish to be the owner, ein lahen. That's not really true. Hilkach, therefore, gabe mincha, for example, by a mincha, let's say it's inherited by yarshim, this was the case on the previous Amud, ksheiruli karv, if it was inherited by 2 yarshim, you could still bring the mincha. The lo de shutfani, it's not considered partners don't bring a kara mincha. Again, we mentioned that in the previous Amud. Avol kapara kufya vitzafa memela yeshlan. It's like a floating kapara, again, an incidental kapara that they have, yeshlan bo, that they have in it, v'hilkach meimer, and therefore that's enough to create tamura. And the Gemara continues, Iboilu, they had the following question, Kipru al mashabo, olo kipru, is it a kapara on what they're coming for, or is it not a kapara? And Rashi explains the question, Kipru al mashabo, kodshim shenizbechu shelo lishman, talking about karbonos which were slaughtered not lishman. So the halacha is yikravu, again the halacha is you offer those karbonos. Utnan, we learned in the Mishnah, lo alu l'shem chova, that it doesn't fulfill the obligation of the owner, v'tzarech lavi acher, and so another carbon does need to be brought. That's what it said in the Mishnah. And so the question over here is as follows, miu mi boy lei, nevertheless the question is, im kipru al hachet shehufreshu olav, let's say this carbon was separated for a particular sin, is it going to be a kapara on that sin? V'nafkamina, and the difference would be shelo yidag min ha'yisurin bein time. He doesn't have to worry about afflictions in between the two karbanos. In other words, the Gemara is suggesting that maybe this carbon that was shelo lishmo, so maybe that carbon is in fact a kapara for the sin that it's being brought for, and it's just that there's an obligation to bring another carbon. Or maybe we could say no, that first carbon is not going to be a kapara at all, and therefore he has to worry, so to speak, about yisurim in the interim, and then when he brings the second carbon, that second carbon will be the kapara. That's the question. And the Gemara continues and says, Amar Rav Shisha B'rei Ravidi, Rav Shisha, the son of Ravidi, says, Mistavra makes sense to say, the low kipru, that the first carbon is not going to be an atonement. The Isal Gadai Dech Kipru, because if you think that it's an atonement, Sheni, Lama Huba, what's the point of bringing the second carbon? Isn't the whole point of bringing another carbon in order to get a kapara? But the Gemara says, V'elamai, but what are you going to say? Low kipru, that it's not a kapara? So Lama Hu Karav, by the same logic, you can ask, why you bring the first carbon if it's not a kapara? Amar Rav Ashi says, Rav Shisha B'rei Ravidi, Hachi Kakashale. Rav Shisha, the son of Ravidi, he was asking as follows. Iyamr b'shlama lo kipra. If you're going to say correctly that the first carbon is not a kapara, so shalo lishmo mikoach lishmo kaasi. So then you'll say that the shalo lishmo is coming because of the lishmo. We'll see Rashi in a moment. V'sheni lamahuba, and then why is the second carbon being brought? L'chaper, that's for an atonement. That would all make sense. Elo yamr kipro, but if you're going to say the first one is a kapara, sheni lamahuba, then we really do have a question, why is the person bringing the second carbon? And Rashi explains, Amar Rav Ashi, Rav Shisha B'rei Ravidi, di yolef lo kipru mi de boy le suye sheni. Rav Shisha B'rei Ravidi, who is understanding that it's not a kapara because of the fact you bring the second, hachi kasha le b'havoas sheni tvei ma'akravas rishon. The reason why he was more bothered by the second carbon than the first carbon is the following reason. Iamr b'shlomo lo kipru. If you're going to say correctly that it's not a kapara, afilu hachi mikrav karvi, and nevertheless that first carbon is brought without being a kapara. Why? T'shalo l'shmo mikoa lishmo kaasi. The shalo lishmo is because of the lishmo, meaning the mitchilaso lishmo hukdash, because this animal, it was consecrated lishmo. It's just that you did the slaughtering, let's say, shalo lishmo, but it did get started lishmo, and so it would make sense you're going to finish up that carbon. V'sheni bo lechaper alachet, and then the second one would come as a kapar on the sin. Kagonim olahi mechaperes alaseh. For example, if it's an ola, it would atone for mitzvahs aseh that are violated. O imoshamu yichaper alashamo, or if it's an asham, so then it will be an atonement for whatever he's guilty of. Then it would make sense. You're bringing the first one to complete that carbon, so to speak, then you bring the second for the atonement. But if the first one is a kapara, really bringing the second one would not make sense, and therefore it makes sense to say the first one is not an atonement, and the second one is in fact an atonement. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. They had the following question. Let's say an asay that's after the separation of the carbon. This is talking about a person bringing a carbon-ola, and we mentioned previously that a carbon-ola is mechaber, it's an atonement for mitzvahs asay that are violated, and it could be multiple mitzvahs asay that it's an atonement for. So the question is, what if a person would designate an animal as a carbon-ola and then violate a mitzvahs asay? Mechapro lo mechapro, would it be a kapara or not? You're bringing this carbon, again, you designated the animal as the carbon before you violated the mitzvahs asay, then you bring the carbon as a carbon-ola. Will that be a kapara for that mitzvah saseh? Mi amrinon, do we say midi dehavi achatas, that it should be similar to a carbon chatas? Ma chatas de kodem hafrasha in de la'achar hafrasha lo. Just like by a carbon chatas, it's only an atonement for the sin that happened before the separation, the designation of the animal, not a sin that happened after the hafrasha. So af hachanami, so to over here by a carbon ola, de kodem hafrasha in la'achar hafrasha lo. It's only going to be a kapara for what happened before the hafrasha, not for what happened after the hafrasha. O dilmor, maybe lo damya lechatas. Maybe it's not similar to a chatas. The chatas al kol chet v'chet boy le suye chad chatas. When it comes to a carbon chatas, on every single individual sin, you have to bring an individual carbon chatas. It's one chatas for one sin. V'hacha, but over here, kevan deika kama asay gabe mechapra asay de la'achar hafrasha nami mechapra. Since if a person has several mitzvahs asay, it would be a kapara on several mitzvahs asay. So maybe it's also kapara on a mitzvah asay that was violated after the hafrasha. That's the question. And the Gemara continues, Tashma, coming here a proof from the following brisa. The pasuk says, V'samach v'nirtza. V'samach is when you do smicha on the animal, you lean upon the animal, and then v'nirtza, then the animal is accepted. And so the brisa says, V'chi smicha mechaperes. Is the smicha what's causing the kapara, the atonement? V'halo ein kapara, ela b'dam. But the kapara really is the blood. Shenemars, it says in the pasuk, Ki hadam hu ba'nefesh yichaper. It says that the dam, the blood, is the kapara. Elamad Talmud lomar v'samach v'nirtza. What does it mean when it says that v'samach v'nirtza l'chaper? What does it mean that it sounds like it's saying the smicha is going to be a kapara? What it means is as follows. Shemasal l'smicha shiyare mitzvah. Let's say a person, he renders the smicha shiyare mitzvah like the leftover mitzvah, meaning to say he doesn't fulfill it, he doesn't consider it to be important. Mala olav hakasav ki'ilu lo chiper v'chiper. The pasuk considers it as if it's not a kapara, but it is a kapara. Now that's a strange line that the Gemara is saying over here, it's not a kapara, but it is a kapara. So what exactly does the brisa mean when it says it's not a kapara, but it is a kapara? So my love, is it not? The keeper asay the kodem hafrasha, that it's going to be a kapara for the mitzvahs asay that were violated before the designation of the animal. But lo keeper asay the smicha, the havelei asay the lachar hafrasha, but it will not be a kapara for the fact that he violated the mitzvahs asay of smicha. In other words, there was a violation here in the course of bringing the karbonola. He didn't do smicha. That's a violation of an asay, but that's an asay la'achar hafrasha, and so that's exactly what the brisa is saying. The brisa is saying that it is a kapara for the mitzvahs asay before hafrasha, but this ola will not be a kapara for the mitzvahs asay that he did during the course of bringing the karbonola, which was a violation of an asay la'achar hafrasha, meaning not doing the smicha. That it is not a kapara for, and therefore would seem to indicate that it is not a kapara for an asay la'achar hafrasha. But the Gemara continues and says, Amar Rava says, Asay de smicha ka'amrit, are you trying to bring a proof from the violation of the asay by smicha? Shani hasam, it's different over there. T'chol kama de lo shachit, because as long as he hasn't actually slaughtered the animal, ba'amod smoch koi, so actually he's still supposed to do the smicha. In other words, there is no violation of the asay of smicha before shchita, because you still have the opportunity to do the smicha. And eimas kohave asay, so when is it that you really have violated the asay of smicha? La'achar shchita, that's already after the slaughtering of the animal that violation takes place. That's not simply la'achar hafrasha. It's not simply after the designation of the animal. It's after the slaughtering of the animal. La'achar shchita lo kami boilan. La'achar shchita is not even a question. Of course, a mitzvah saseh. Of course, the karbonola is not going to be an atonement for a violation of a mitzvah saseh that took place after shchita, and therefore there would be no proof whatsoever from smicha. The Gemara continues, Amarle Rav Huna bar Yehuda l'Rava. Rav Huna bar Yehuda said to Rava, Eimo, let us say, kiper gavra, that it's an atonement for the person. And Rashi explains, kiper gavra, let's say that the brisa means that it's an atonement for the person, meaning al kol asay shabiyado, meaning it is an atonement for any mitzvah asay that he did, v'nitzol min hayisur, and therefore he'll be saved from any afflictions. And we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Vav Amud Beis.